Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I want to welcome you back to the second episode of this series that we are calling Refuting Dan Gibson, with a question mark, of course. Last time, Dan did an excellent job explaining why most objections or attempt to refute his arguments fail simply because of the amount of data that is available, that every person who claims to have refuted Dan Gibson's theory have to go through all of these data and demonstrate why Dan or the data that he has collected do not really represent facts and do not represent what we are dealing with at the moment, which is majority of early Islamic Qiblas or mosques face towards Petra. I mean, it's really fascinating to me that just on the surface, someone has to ask the question, why Petra? And we're not talking one, we're not talking two, we're not talking five, we're not talking 10, 170 plus so far facing in that direction. Coincidence? Wow, that's amazing, really. I'll buy a lottery ticket if that's the case, because it seemed like it's a lot of coincidences here leading in one direction. So we cannot really build our arguments just on an emotional basis. Just because I don't like Dan Gibson's argument, somehow I'm going to try to find just one of his pillars. And if I am able to cast doubt about that pillar, I'm going to go now and make a claim that I have refuted Dan Gibson. And folks, you think I'm kidding. Someone reached out to me that Dan is aware of course, who made the claim that he has refuted Dan Gibson completely. And I looked at the argument and I said, you have to be kidding me. If this is how we refute arguments, then I guess there is no need for data or facts anymore. I can do it sitting at my office at home and just making that claim day in and day out. It doesn't work that way. So we have a theory. We called it Dan Gibson's theory. Dan himself is calling it Dan Gibson theory, and he's making no apologies about it. The data that he collected allowed him to come up with a theory. Nothing wrong with that. That's what academia allows you, by the way. But let's talk about two explanations, or theory one and theory two, if you wish. With that in mind, I'm going to ask Dan, who is joining us right now remotely, to take us from here. Dan, once again, thank you so much, brother, for taking the time to be with us. What did you mean by two explanations or two theories?
Okay, first of all, let me apologize if you get a blip on your screen. That's coming from my camera here. I'm not sure why it's doing that. The question is, what happens if somebody does come along with another theory? Does that then disprove my theory? And if somebody comes along with a third theory, does that then disprove the other two? So the question is, can two theories exist using the same database? That is, if we bring that up on the slide, just so you can see that, the data that we found, as you said, more than 170 mosques have been discovered from the first 3 centuries of Islam. Some are facing Petra, some are facing a between position, a few are facing Mecca, the later ones, some are using a parallel direction that was used in North Africa, and so forth. So we need to come up with why do these different Qiblas seem to exist. So several theories can exist at the same time. Dr. King has come up with a theory. He just says it's all coincidence. And so he has his theory, he has his supporting data. And so does his theory disprove my theory? Does my theory disprove his theory? The question is, can two theories be there at the same time, and then you can look at them, and as a viewer you need to make an intelligent decision if you think one of these theories is a plausible explanation. So can two theories exist at the same time? I'm going to give you a story. I came up with this one time out walking with my sons on a road at night, and we came across, as we were looking down, some skid marks on the road. There was black tire, there were 2 parallel skid marks on the road. And I said to my son, I said, it looks like some kids were out here last night squealing their tires. And my son looked at it and said, no, I think the car was going the other way, and maybe there was a deer on the road and somebody hit their brakes and put skid marks going the other way. Right. And so just imagine that we could have a disagreement over the data. We're both looking at the very same data, but each of us are seeing 2 different scenarios that could be out of that same data. Is that possible? Now, imagine if we then started to go and get our friends and bring people over and start to show them. And I said, no, look, when you spin the tires, it gets more rubber at the beginning until the car takes off. And my son would say, no, when you brake, it pushes and you get more rubber at this end. And so we're looking at the same data. We could go get experts and they could work on this data from both sides, and we could start getting upset with one another, which often happens. It becomes very emotional. And, I'm saying, no, it was kids who are doing it. And my son could be saying, no, you're just against kids. You just don't like young people today. You just think they're all bad. This has got nothing to do with young people. And we could all, suddenly we wouldn't be talking to one another because we'd be all angry at what each other are saying. So, I mean, I'd love to have somebody act that out and put together a skit for that. But can we look at the same data and come up with different theories, and do those theories actually disprove the other? Just because I have a theory, does that disprove that any other theory could exist? And what happens if I shout really loud, if I get lots of people on my side, if I write papers and get a whole bunch of people behind me and get lots of voice, does that make my theory correct and the other theory wrong? And so this is common in everyday life. This is something you and I face every day, all the time. It really does affect our lives. And it could be maybe we start comparing political systems. Is a kingship better than democracy? And we could have an argument, and we could all be looking at same data and come up with two different theories. This has happened in the evolution versus creation. And it's not that creationists are blind. They're looking at the very same data the evolutionist is looking at. The evolutionist says, I see evolution going over millions of years. The creationist is looking at it, or maybe it's some intelligent design is looking at it and saying, I see intelligent design in this process. I don't see just chance over millions of years. So they're looking at exactly the same data. They're not blind, but they are coming up with two different conclusions. That's happened recently with the COVID virus that has been going around. People are looking at the COVID virus. They're looking at different data, and they're coming up with two different theories. Some people are dead set against things, and other people are for it, and it divides people. People get very upset over this. So, what happens if another theory comes along? And so, as we were pointing out in the last program, I welcome new theories to come along, because someone may actually see things better than I do. They might have a different view of looking at it, and if they can come along and argue and present their material, and I'm all for that. I'm not against that. What I don't like is when people come along and pick, as you said, one item and say, oh, okay, now Dan Gibson is disproved because I've got a better theory. I think Dr. King said it was just all chance, and so there it is, it's all chance. Well, now we have two theories that I know of that are out there, what to do with this data. And so a number of scholars have stepped in, and there's people who have been writing. There's a number of scholarly papers that have been published in journals asking the question, was this by chance? And so they're looking at the data, and now they're debating the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
So can there be two theories? I think multiple theories can exist, but it doesn't change the data. And that's what we want to come back to. Even if my theory is disproved, the data still stands and other theories have got to be developed.
So what I hear you say, Dan, it's not the number of scholars, it's the data that can dictate, how a theory could be refuted or developed as a result of this.
That's right. And so if someone discovers data that disproves a theory, then that theory can fall. Now, when I first noted Petra was the original Qibla, this was back in 2010, I immediately set about trying to refute that theory. because I thought it can't be possible. I mean, it just sounds so strange. It sounds so weird. It can't be. I should be able to easily refute that proposals which I had made, because that's what I thought I'm looking at when I look at the data. So I began to work on. I began to publish things. I immediately put things out onto the web. The reason was that I wanted other people's opinion, because I need not just my eyes. I needed more eyes. I was working with, there was like 40 other scholars who were giving me information, feeding me information. So we put that together. But then I wanted it more, and so we opened it up wide. Well, immediately the first response I got is, what do you do with the graveyard in Mecca where Abdul Muttalib is buried, and where Amina is buried, and where some other people are buried? What do you do with those graveyards? And I thought, there it is. My theory's been refuted. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, let me go look at these graveyards. So I went and looked at these graveyards, and I immediately saw one of the graves. And I thought, wait a minute, that person is not buried in that graveyard. That person is buried in another place. And so I immediately recognized that grave exists in another place, not in Mecca. So now we have two graves for that person. And then the more I looked at it, I realized the graves that were there in Mecca were not graves. They were shrines to those people that had been built over the years. And the Saudi government, recognizing them as shrines, and people were going there to get special barakah or something. And
Right.
so the Saudi government decided to bulldoze that graveyard because of the way people were acting about it.
Right.
Created a huge uproar. But also they recognized, they researched, those graves were not authentic. So sometimes people come along and it seems like, oh, they've disproved the theory, but the other person needs to be able to come back and respond to that and explain why the theory still stands, even though something seems to knock it down.
Well, Dan, let me close by asking you this question. Have you received any interest from the academic field where people want to do maybe PhD research on data like this? Because you've done most of the work, really, for a researcher.
Not PhD data at this point. I mean, I've had people ask me about what they think a PhD might be able to do. Yeah, we've discussed things. I don't know of anyone doing a PhD. I do know of a number of scholarly papers that are in progress or have been just recently published. And I'm working with a couple of other scholars, hoping to turn out some scholarly papers for journals, present them to journals. That will be happening probably in this next year. So more of this information will come out. Again, the question is, papers can be about the data, and it could be about the interpretation of the data, which is what I call Dan Gibson's theory.
Wonderful. So we talked about two explanations. Next week or next time, at least we'll be talking about the best explanation. Are you referring to one of these two, or do you have a third one?
No, we're going to look at, if you look at the data, how can you interpret this data? I mean, you can react to the data in different ways. I'd like to look at 5 different ways that people have reacted when they see the data.
Wonderful, wonderful. Dan, thank you so much as always, brother. What a blessing, really, to have this amount of information presented to us by in my view, a scholar like you. I know sometimes people try to attack, your background. Sadly, that's ad hominem. And that's, not the right way to refute arguments just because you feel like, hey, Dan didn't do this or Dan doesn't have that. Forget about Dan right now. Focus on the data. You are welcome to go and investigate the data for yourself. Dan is not hiding it from you, by the way. I think, Dan, you have something called something tool. I can't recall now what it was. The Qibla tool?
The Qibla tool. It's on nabatea.net website. And you can go there and you can actually look down on satellite, zoom in using Google Earth, and you can actually see these buildings and you can check them out for yourself.
There you go. You heard him. He says Google Earth. Dan doesn't own Google Earth, so he cannot manipulate data for you. So you're just going to have to go and rely on these available technologies that everyone these days uses for a variety of things. How come when it comes to the Qibla, somehow it is not desirable anymore? So this really saddens me, Dan, by the way, because I want my Muslim people to at least appreciate the effort and the work and the risk. By the way, you are risking your life by coming up with data that you and I know is antagonistic to the standard Islamic narrative. Yet at the end of the day, you don't have an agenda. It's not like you're doing it because somehow you're trying to retaliate against something, that happened to you, or you're trying to entice a movement, or you're trying to confuse people. It's just something that the Lord put in your heart. You're fascinated by it. You discover something from an observation, just reading the Quran alone at the beginning, and noticing the geography of the Quran was pointing to an area that does not really fit the bill, if you wish. And, it should have been the focus of Islamic scholars all along. They're the one who should have noticed these things and should have at least asked the question, why does the Quran focus on things that are up north more so than what we believe is the original, basically, site, which is Mecca? You don't find a whole lot of things about Mecca. You find a whole lot of things about north, towns and cities and areas and so on and so forth. Well, thank you as always, brother. And I can't wait until we meet again next time to discuss these best explanations. Everyone, hope you've been enjoying this series that we have entitled Refuting Dan Gibson with a question mark. Until we meet again next time, have a blessed day. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, CIRA International, and click on the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we publish a new video or go live. I would also like to appeal to you to consider becoming a Patreon patron by clicking the link right below. By doing so, you can give towards the production of these videos. There are also other options for you where you can give to our channel. I thank you from the bottom of my heart.